I'm Doug Llewellyn, and welcome to CUTV News Presents. Today, the remarkable story of Dr. Madelyn Blair. She began life as a child on a farm, collecting eggs from the chicken coop and feeding the pigs. And she rose to extraordinary heights in the corporate arena with positions such as a division chief of the World Bank, headquartered in Washington, and the founder of her own consulting firm for over 30 years, with clients ranging from the likes of the National Institutes of Health, NASA, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, among others. By the way, she has degrees in math, in finance, and organizational psychology. And she is a graduate of, among others, the renowned Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She is a speaker, the author of 4 books, and a resilience advisor specializing in resilience leadership. It's a subject she has spoken about to groups literally around the world and currently teaches to students in her role as a member of the faculty at Columbia University in New York and Walden University in Baltimore. She's with us today to talk about one of her books, Riding the Current, which deals with the overwhelming amount of data and information that we are constantly bombarded with throughout our daily lives. We get it in the morning on the radio and our newspaper. You get it on your cell phones, your iPad, your laptops, and your computers, and even your watches. It's an overwhelming stream of constant emails, advertisements, and news headlines. And for many people, it is simply overwhelming. And if that includes you, then Dr. Madelyn Blair is someone you're going to want to listen to. Let's meet her now. I'm not overemphasizing it, this deluge of data. It can be overwhelming, can't it?
Absolutely, it can be overwhelming. In fact, I still find it overwhelming at times, and I know that my colleagues do as well.
You wrote a book called Riding the Current, which really dealt with this, but you wrote the book 10 years ago, and now you're doing an update on it. Why do you feel that's necessary?
Well, first of all, it was only 8 years ago, but you're right. I was writing it 10 years ago and doing the research before that. Why did I do an update? There are a couple of reasons. One is that millennials have now come into the workforce, and millennials grew up quite differently. And I want to tap into how they do it, how they bring fresh knowledge into their lives. Remember, in the book, I have interviewed all kinds of people and gotten their stories. I want to get some millennial stories because I think they may be different. Don't know, haven't done that yet. That's one reason. The other reason is that this is a topic that hasn't really changed in what I'll call the deep theoretical parts of it. We learn as human beings the same way that we always have learned as human beings. So that part stays the same. What I want to do is bring in these news stories, and I want to bring in the connection between getting fresh knowledge and the work that I do in resilience. Because it turns out that one of the things I discovered was that resilient people have deep knowledge. And if that's the case, then I want the readers of my book to see that they're not just getting knowledge as they go through the book and develop their approach to it, but they're also building their resilience. And today, resilience is incredibly important. The world is changing so fast, you've got to be able to easily adjust.
It's interesting you came up with the title 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the deluge of data wasn't nearly as bad then as it is now.
Yes.
I mean, it's overwhelming now.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Crazy world.
It's not only overwhelming, it's now very confused because there's a lot of information that comes at us that is really not real information. It's planted and it's false.
Sure.
And it's interwoven and it looks like the real thing.
Fake news.
Fake. Yes.
Use a term, popular term, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And when I interviewed in the book, and I'm pretty sure her stories got in there, she talked about how she validated information, because this was a woman who wrote a newsletter every day on a particular, and this was a political area. And I said, how do you do this? And she said, she gathers her information, and unless she gets the same kind of information from at least 3 sources, she won't use it. Yeah. And she said, but after a while, you begin to discover the really true and reliable sources. And then you don't have to do quite so much checking, but still, that's the key. You need to have it verified across, and they have to be across legitimate sources.
In your efforts to do all the research for the book and interviewing lots of people, what kind of people did you talk to?
Oh gosh, I had a great selection of people because, first of all, I gave myself the time, and secondly, I was traveling a great deal at that time. So I have interviews from people across 4 different continents. I asked people of all different ages. I think the youngest was 17, the oldest was 82, so it spanned 65 years. I interviewed carpenters, I interviewed computer specialists, I interviewed physicians and politicians, all kinds of people, because I wanted to see, does it vary across different socioeconomic levels? And that's why I had to interview lots of people.
And what were you asking them? What were you trying to find out?
Well, I had a long, I call it a protocol, when you have a series of questions that you ask regularly. And I would always ask them to think about a time when they were learning well and to describe that to me. So I really would get inside, hopefully inside, where they were, how they were approaching getting and learning new information. And then I would ask some specific questions about how they did it. And oftentimes people would say, you know, I never thought about that before, and then they would proceed to talk about it. There were all kinds of questions, but that's what I was getting at, was how did they do it? Because, you know, you can talk about how adults learn from a theoretical perspective, and people have done that for years. But theory was not what I wanted. I wanted practical things that I could then say to people, look, here's the practical way to do it. Now apply what makes sense to you in your life.
How do you learn is a tough question to answer sometimes. I mean, that could have stumped people, I would think. They have to stop and think, right?
Oh, yeah. And of course, I asked them to think about a time when they felt they were learning well. And so, yes, you're right. They had to think about it and say, okay, was it when I was in college? Was it when oh no, it was when I was trying that new project and I had to learn. So that's why I asked that particular way. But you're right, it's a tough question.
Any particular comments that you think now that had a major impact on the book itself and what you put in the book?
There were many stories that I heard, but every now and then there was a story that just hit me between the eyes. And it began to not just form how I did the book, but energized me even more. An example was a representative, a delegate to our state assembly. I live in Maryland, so he was in the Maryland delegation. He described how he went into that with a real position on stem cell research. And he initiated and worked for the cutting off of any stem cell research in Maryland. And they got that legislation through. And he said, but all the time I knew I was doing it for the wrong reason. And he told this story of having a picnic with his family and how his father and his sister, both suffering from diabetes, one because of diet, the other because of genetics. And they were talking about the fact that stem cell research would help their conditions. And he said to me, at that moment I realized I needed to know more. And he, as in his position, he calls up, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And he said, I want to find out about this. And they said, sure, come over to the lab. They gave him a whole day in the lab to see what they do in research. And at one point he said, the director came in and he said, I want to show you something. And he said, it's not going to be comfortable for you. And he picked up a test tube and he said, you know, all the work that we do has to do with stem cells. And we want to get them from even embryos that are no longer needed or usable, which is what you have prevented. He said, now let me tell you what happens to the embryos that are frozen, that people are paying to have you take care of, and decide, okay, they don't want them anymore, and so they stop paying for the support of those frozen embryos. He says, this is what happens to them. And he turned the test tube over and poured it down the drain. And Rick said, then it hit me. And when I heard that story, I thought, wow, there are moments when people really reach out to learn something, and they open their minds so completely that they'll allow assumptions that they've made to be questioned. And that's when you get really deep learning.
What are you doing to update the book? Are you interviewing a lot more people now, all over again?
I'm going to interview probably about 10, but I'm going to focus my interviews on millennials because I want to hear those stories and see if, looking across those stories, I can see any shifts that I have to make in the rest of the book where I talk about strategies and that sort of thing. So it will be about 10 people. I've had, I think, just one interview. That was just a preliminary interview, but that's what I'll do. In addition to that, I'm looking at the work that I've done in resilience, and I'm folding that into the book so that people can see there is a relationship between keeping yourself fresh and being resilient, because resilience is so, as I said before, so essential today.
So what can someone who reads this book expect to get out of it?
I think what they can get out of it are a couple of things. One is a real appreciation for the fact that as adults, we continue to learn in a myriad of ways. Secondly, if you're really serious and you make the decision that you really want to bring this into your life a little more consciously, you'll have, I think in the book I counted there are over 100 strategies that you can pick from. And there's a whole process that you have to go through. You know, everything from figuring out what are your strengths, your natural strengths, where do you normally read your materials, who do you want to have come on the trip with you. I refer to it as a journey, as you ride the current in your boat. And you put those things together and you come out with, for yourself, your own strategy, which is precisely what I did as well when I wrote it.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Writing a book is really hard.
Yeah, I know.
You know, I'm trying to remember. It was a full year, and that was with lots of editorial help as well.
You know, I can't help but wonder, looking at your background, did you envision at any point you would be doing what you're doing now, writing books and lecturing on leadership and resilience? And
No.
Totally different, huh?
No. I love to work with people. And I realized that was my strength. I love to interact with them. I love to be in small groups. I love to be even with large groups. And finally, I got to where my message was, I thought, fairly significant and important to many people. And as a human being, you can only interact with so many. So I said, okay, it's time to put that wisdom in a book. And that's why I did it.
You know, in spite of all the resources that are available today, from the internet, the constant flow of information that comes to you, a lot of people still may feel isolated. And I'm just wondering if your book can help them feel more comfortable about that.
You know, it is a strange anomaly, isn't it, that in this world of connection, we have people who do feel precisely that, isolated. If they work through the book and actually do the exercises that I provide, each chapter, by the way, has some exercises that you can do to prepare yourself. There are several of them that actually have you work with someone. For example, I say, in one of the chapters, I say you need a crew on your ship that you're going to take this journey on. So go out and find people that you want to travel with. And one of those people is called the accompanier. And this is the person who kind of has the bigger picture, so that when you feel like you're getting lost, you can go and talk to this person and they can give you the bigger picture and say, okay, now I see it, and I can keep on going. Oftentimes that's your manager. It doesn't have to be, though. The second person that I recommend that the person actually connect with is what I call a practice partner. Now, a practice partner is someone who is, first of all, knows you, has your best interest at heart, but they're also curious, and they like to ask questions. Because when you're trying to learn, sometimes it's necessary for you to talk about it, to explore what you what you're thinking about, and the questions that someone asks you really helps you dive deeper into what you know. And you actually literally learn from responding to those questions. So I say find a practice partner. Now the interesting thing is, by the way, that when people have read the book and done what is recommended there, they almost always come back to me and say, now I have a practice partner. Or they say, now I have a name for the person that I've always used as a practice partner. So that apparently really connects with a lot of people. The third person you might want to have is a fellow seeker, I call them. Someone who just simply is going to be your buddy as you go through this. Now, those are 3 people that you have to interact with in order to accomplish the book. There's also another section where you have to interview people. That's a real fun one, because they have to go out and they have to ask people. Now, when we have worked together in the past, when was it that you felt that I was really adding good knowledge or information for the project? So you begin to get a sense of how other people see you, and that's a great way to connect with people. So actually, although I would not have anticipated this as one of the results of the book, it would be that you would be connecting.
That's interesting. There's a term, lifelong learning. What do you mean by that? What is that? What does it really mean?
It's been around for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who coined the term, I'm not quite sure why their rationale was for it, but the reality was they tapped into something that was very important. We learn more and more and more as a whole, I'll call it a community of humanity. We learn a great deal more today than at a faster pace than we did previously. There are more people exploring, right? So there was a recognition that there was more to learn. There was also recognition that jobs had changed, so that if you didn't stay current or be open to new possibilities, your job may have disappeared, and if you don't have the capability, you're lost. So the lifelong learning was all about how do you prepare yourself to always be, I hate the term marketable, but that's the right word,
Sure.
to be marketable as you go along. And as the world changes, you're still marketable. So that was where lifelong learning started. To me, lifelong learning is all about living.
And why is it even talked about at all?
I think it was talked about, or is talked about, by people who are concerned about workforces. Because if you're I've been an executive for many years, and I know that if I go out to find a particular skill and it's not there, that's a tough situation for me. When I can go out into the marketplace and it's there, great, grab it in and employ it. If you don't have that, then it's much more difficult to develop that. And I think that it was organizations that saw that they had to continue to bring in, they had to continue to have people who were knowledgeable. Because technology progressed, our knowledge, just our general knowledge progressed, you had to make sure that those were people who had brought in that knowledge and could continue to do so. You needed a workforce.
It's interesting. Let me ask you a quick question. You are known as a resilience master, a leadership of resilience. A lot of people may wonder, what really do you mean by that term? Explain that to me. What is resilience in the way you're using it?
Okay. Most of the time when people hear the word resilience, they think of bouncing back. That's the immediate response.
Right.
I kept looking back and I said, that's not quite right. It's not about being positive. It's really not about the ongoing activities. It's about that moment when you get hit with that shock or that change, and it could be positive as well as negative. And you've got to make a decision about that. I call that the space. In fact, Viktor Frankl called it the space between stimulus and response. And in that space is your power to choose your response. That's what Viktor Frankl said, and I think he was absolutely right. To me, that's precisely where resilience lies. It's that ability to deal with whatever the impact is and say, all right, this is what I'm going to choose to do. So that to me, a person who falls on a sidewalk and has to recover, there's a decision there to be, are you going to be resilient today? Are you going to get up and move on? That's one example, a quick one. But then there's also people who have to take care of aging parents. And there, the decision is every day, every day. It may not be a surprise, but that stimulus is still there. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And you choose each day to take care of that parent. So those are resilient people as well. So it's right there in that space.
So there are many examples of it.
Oh, yes.
Obviously in business as well.
Oh, yes.
Somebody gets fired, they have to be resilient to try and bounce back.
Yes,
Same thing.
Yes, they do. They have to choose whether they're going to take it positively
Right.
or whether they're going to take it negatively.
Let's take an example of someone who's in a slump. Maybe they did get fired. Why would they turn to a book like what you have written? And how do you think that could help them?
Well, when you're in a slump, it's pretty hard to get the, what's the right word, the right energy to say, I'm going to read a book.
Yeah.
But in fact, if maybe somebody encourages them or whatever, and they decide that, okay, maybe the answer is here, and I'll make that assumption that they've made that choice to open the book. One of the things they'll do is interview people in terms of examples from their life that other people have seen where they brought value. And during those interviews, it's very possible that they'll discover things about themselves they didn't know. Always affirming things, always positive things. I always design those things so that you are hearing about moments of success or moments when you were effective. If they do those exercises, that will help pull them out of a slump because they'll begin to focus on, hey, this is really what they said, and she said, and he said. And suddenly they begin to see there's value there. May not have fit the role that they had, but they have something that they can bring to the table. And I think everybody wants to know that they bring some value to the table.
Suppose somebody's considering taking a break, taking a year off, for example. Would this book help guide them in ways to make that year more valuable for them?
Oh, very definitely, because there you see you have a clear decision. Person has chosen to actually focus on something different. Now, they may say, well, I'm going to take the year off because I'm tired. Well, that's one reason to do it. Right. Friend of mine took a year off because he wanted to refresh his knowledge in his particular area. And that was a perfect time for him to say, all right, what is it that I know? What is it where I feel there are gaps? And with a year off, how wonderful that I can take some time and fill those gaps. So in that case, it's a perfect example of where the book can be helpful. It is somewhat related, but maybe not directly. I have a colleague in Europe, and she calls me every time she gets a new project. And she said, well, I pulled the book out again, and I followed a chapter, and she'll tell me where she did what she did. And lo and behold, she applies this every time because she sees it as an opportunity to fill in gaps or prepare for a new project, whatever it is. So, yes.
What about people who may want to change careers altogether, start a whole new journey in their life? Is this a helpful guide for them?
Yes, it is.
Can it be?
It can. That's right. The first thing they have to do, and that's one of the things that I talk about in chapters 1 and 2, is you have to decide a little bit about what you're looking for. Right. It could be that you're shifting from one field to another. Well, if you've decided on the other field, then now you have a clear focus. I sometimes call it the boundaries where you really want to learn something more. And that would be one of the first things that you would do. And then you'd follow on with the book. Yep.
Another example, suppose somebody is considering retiring altogether. They're not going to work anymore. They have to do something, though, don't they? They can't just stop doing everything.
As a matter of fact, that is precisely how I believe. Now, I think some people actually go to retirement thinking, oh, this is it. Finally, I can get my rewards. And oftentimes when I talk to these people, they're bored or they feel a little uneasy because, you know, going to the theater every day really wasn't as fun as they thought it was going to be. I actually think as human beings, we have to feel like we're contributing. That must be built into our DNA, that we are needed. And that's where I think people who are retired are in such a great opportunity to say, I have this whole vast career that I've done. Okay, that's chapter 1, or that's act 1. Now I've got another opportunity. And today we're living to such ages that there's no reason to not move into, not necessarily another career, although many retired people that I know are moving into another career. It could be an avocation. They're painting, and that requires a certain learning. It could be that they're, excuse me, that they're doing community work, and that requires a little bit. So I think that retirement is just a great time because you're very relaxed. You've got an income. If you've planned well, you at least know that you're set that way. You don't have to worry about where the money's coming from. And so now you can build yourself, develop yourself, and contribute to the world.
Did you talk to a lot of retired people?
Well, I talked to them probably just before they retired.
Did you find they're happy? I mean, from the ones you did talk to?
Yes. The ones who keep going are incredibly happy. An example of this is Peter Block. Peter Block has written many, many books, many, many bestsellers, and he never stops. And I remember one of his things he said to me was, Madeleine, I changed the topic the area that I pursue, every 6 or 7 years. It keeps me engaged. I mean, this is a man who's constantly engaged. Well, that's how he does it.
Because, you know, we hear stories about people who retire and then turn around, you know, a year later they die. I guess they die out of boredom.
Well, I can't say
Maybe
that.
not,
I
unless
can't
it's
say.
physical, you know.
Yeah, I can't say
But
that.
it does
for
happen
sure.
a lot. They shrivel up.
Yes, and I think there are many people today who are very concerned about keeping their brain active.
Yeah.
Well, learning is the way to do it. I mean, truly, because your brain has to work hard to learn. It's constantly bringing in new things, and it's not just bringing in new stuff, but it's integrating that into what you already know. And that's the real fun part as far as I'm concerned.
And it's so easy to keep learning these days. I mean, we talk about your cell phones, your laptop. You know, your cell phone goes off every 2 minutes. There's a new headlines, there's advertisements. You know, Macy's sale is off in 2 hours. You better hurry. Or emails from friends. It's a deluge of information.
Yes. Yes.
Just what you talk about.
Just what I talk about. That's right. And there's also, in addition to all of this, you have all the newscasts that you can listen to. I mean, how many people listen to multiple newscasts and feel that they must do that? That's hard. I had to make that decision myself. Okay, what's going to be my source of news? Because I cannot sit in front of the television for hours and hours and hours and do my work. So I made some choices around that.
What are the benefits one gets from retirement, or what can they be?
Well, I can
Can be
only.
great.
They should be great.
Yeah.
They should be great. To me, this is the time when you have all this wisdom of life, and you should put yourself in a place where you can share that wisdom, where young people need it. It's one of the reasons I continue to teach. I love working with young people. I love their energy. I love their hope. But every now and then they'll hit a snag and they don't quite understand what's happening. And if they ask, and I always wait until they ask, and then I'll give them my perspective. And I always say, this is my perspective. This is my experience. But they can then decide from what they see in that, okay, that makes sense to me. And they can move on. So I think that's what we should be doing. I think that's one of the reasons why human beings live so long past their reproductive years.
You know, you're in a really unique position. I mean, you've had a magnificent career. Now, you're teaching young people at one of the most prestigious schools in the country, at Columbia in New York. What are you instructing? What are you trying to get across to them? Again, it's resilience you're focusing on, right? That's the course.
Well, I teach resilience. I also teach knowledge management. I'm actually in a program called Information and Knowledge Strategy. So it's a rather complex thing. What we're really talking about is collaboration, believe it or not, because organizations really need to have more collaboration going on. And collaboration means that you're sharing knowledge that you have. And it's to me, a lot of the work and the solutions lie in the interaction of all that different knowledge.
My question really is, what do you get out of working with young people at this point
yes,
in your
thank
life?
you.
It's got to be extraordinarily inspirational to you, I would think.
Yes, it is. Thank you. What I see is how they view the world.
Yeah.
I mean, any parent knows that when you're watching a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old discover the world, you actually discover it with them because you have that empathy with them, and you feel that excitement of seeing that snow is cold, right? Well, when you're watching young people learn, even in the graduate level, you still can have that same kind of feeling, good feeling, that, gosh, they figured this out themselves. And it's as if you have just figured it out. That, to me, is very exciting. Now, what do I want to teach them really? What I really want to teach them is that they're capable, that they can think that through, because they're the future. There is no other hope except our young people. And anybody who puts down young people, to me, is just being foolish. They are the future. So for me, when I'm working with them, I always want to emphasize to them, these are the things you do really well. Now let's tie up these other things where you're not so great. Because as part of a teacher, that's part of your role, is to critique. But I always do that with a balance so that they never feel diminished.
And doing that has to keep you young, you know? It does. Don't you feel that way?
Absolutely.
Oh, you're learning too.
Oh, yes. And I learn from every situation. People think I'm crazy, but I'll go to a workshop that's boring as hell. And so I'll stop and say, okay, the content is boring. I know this stuff. Now let me watch other things. Who is attending to this? Why do I think they are so interested in this topic? How is the instructor doing? What are they doing to capture the audience, to keep them engaged? Even though I'm sitting here with a perfectly blank face on because I'm bored with the content. That then becomes a different learning experience for me. So for me, always I'm looking for ways in which I can understand what's happening in front of me.
You're talking about this subject, resilience leadership, to students at Columbia here, but you travel around the world and talk to people about this subject. Do they respond to it differently in Europe or wherever you're talking to them?
No, they respond the same. They really do. Even in China. Now, I wasn't talking about resilience there. I was actually talking about the book. And it was interesting because one of the things I said was you've got to ask questions. Remember the practice party?
Right.
Well, in China, to ask the professor a question, you just don't do that. It's just not the norm. And when I posed to them the idea of a practice partner, suddenly it was in a small, intimate kind of relationship where they could ask a question. And I'll never forget, the manager came up to me and he says, we have a new strategy here. So, yes, my audiences respond.
Let's talk about parents. Parents believe that education obviously is the key to success for their children. What do you think parents can learn from this book?
The book actually has 2 books in it. One is a book for the seeker, the person who's actually trying to develop their capability. And there's a whole book in there about what the accompanier does as the seeker moves through the process. I did that consciously because I've worked with so many managers who haven't a clue how to develop their staff. And I have done it for years. So I put those instructions in there. I said, okay, accompanier, when they're doing this, this is what you do. And sometimes the instructions were, give them time, leave them alone. At other times it was, answer the questions, tell them the big picture. So that there are literally as instructions for that accompanier all the way through. I've envisioned that this is something that could be done as a team, for example. A new project team might want to explore it. And then the manager, or the team leader, or the project manager knows exactly what they need to do. All right. That's what, to me, parents could really read through and say, this is how I can help my child when they're working through these things. Now, whether the child is working through the process or whether the child is just simply being who a child is, the parent is more aware of what they can potentially do to really facilitate the learning in the child.
And what age are you talking about at this point with a child? Really young?
I think almost any age, because what most of the instructions to the young company are provide the answers and provide the information that's needed at the moment. Don't tell them 17 things out because they can't absorb that. Tell them what they need at that moment. Observe, support, encourage. So it's at any age you should be doing that.
People living frugally. I mean, they assume that they have enough money, they're going to be all right if they don't overspend and be careful. Why would someone like that want to read this book? They're retired, right?
Presumably, you could call it retirement.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
What would they get out of this book? What do you have
Well, you know,
to guide them there?
That's an interesting because yes, you could lead a frugal life and save your money, but to think of all the young people who become billionaires because they suddenly sold their company. They're in that same boat. Suddenly you are economically free, because that's really what it means. You're economically free.
Okay.
You can choose the rest of your life. Some people would say, well, I'm going to live on a desert island. Well, go ahead if you want to do that. To me, that's an invitation to do all kinds of things in the world. And the book would then would give you a sense of, all right, if I want to really do that, I have to learn something. All right, I go here, and this will help me do it, or this will help me keep going as I proceed. And I think there are a lot more people who fall in that category than just the people who live frugally.
You know, we're talking about how this book might guide people at certain points in their life. I'm wondering, what about you? You wrote the book. Mm-hmm. Has the book guided you in your life's direction, and how so?
Absolutely. When I first did it, and literally I did every single exercise that I put in the book. Yeah. And I wrote a journal through the whole thing. And in fact, the book has selections from my journal. And I'll never forget, I got to one point where it said, inventory all the publications that you get. Well, I get a ton of publications, right? And now they're more electronic than hard copy, but hard copy is still real. And I said, you're not reading them all, so you've got to cut some of these out. So
what to cut?
Yeah, well, I chose what I was going to cut. and then afterwards I went, oh, but I miss it. So I would bring it back in. But then I had to find time to read it, you know, because I said, you can bring it back in, you have to find a way to read it. So it gives me a discipline, always gives me a discipline. Another thing that I discovered was many of my clients, in fact, most of my clients, want to know that you're aware of what's happening in the world, the current events, right? Because they live in that world, so they want to know that you understand it. I said, Madeline, you don't read a newspaper. And I didn't. I never did. I said, I got to read a newspaper. So I picked a newspaper, and that's the one I read every morning. And I set aside a certain amount of time. And now I am definitely up on current events. But it took a real choice.
Let's talk about your coaching. How would you describe yourself as a coach? Are you a resilient leadership coach? Is that it?
Yes.
Are you a business coach? What are you?
Yes. Well, when you coach someone, you're coaching them in relationship to what their issues are, their desires are, their vision is for themselves. So you really have to bring everything that you have from your experience and your knowledge to whatever that event is, or whatever that purpose is. So if you say, am I a business coach or am I a resilient leadership coach, the answer is yes, because I bring both of those capabilities to the table.
Okay. Talk to me about the company that you started some 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Was it originally intended to be a consulting practice? Is that how it began?
Yes, it was. And I spent a lot of time naming it. And the name of it is Pellerai. And it comes
Where
from...
did that word come from?
I invented it.
I thought you did. If I Googled it, will I find it on Google? Probably not.
Oh, of course you will.
I will.
Because Pellerai is all over the place.
Right.
I mean, my company.
Right.
I spent about 2 hours looking at root words because what I wanted to do was hide the reason I created this company in the name of it, because I wanted to remind myself why I had done it. What it means basically is to raise people up, because that's what I want to do. In everything that I do, I want to raise people up, make them feel effective and valuable and useful. But I didn't want to say that my name of my company is making people feel good or raising people. So I hid it.
What kind of organization and companies have you served as a consultant to? And why would they bring you in? What were they looking for?
Most of my clients began from the areas that I was aware of or I was known, because I had spent 10 years at the World Bank as a division chief. So the World Bank hired me, the International Monetary Fund hired me, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, so the UN, I mean, those kinds of organizations called international organizations. So that was where my practice began. But then my reputation became known, and I would get calls in from Marriott or from NIH. Usually it was word of mouth. I didn't spend a lot of time marketing. Fortunately, I didn't have to. People knew who I was and would talk about me. And so I got calls from a lot of people.
Did you find that invigorating, challenging?
Yes. Challenging because every time you walk into a client, you know that you're there for a particular reason.
Right.
And you need to find out what that reason is. Sometimes that reason is because they have a problem. Sometimes they have the reason is that they're trying to do something that they can't quite imagine how to do it. Sometimes they want you to be the fall guy. And when I find that out, I try to extricate myself, because that's not what I'm there for. But I've had people bring me in just because they thought they had a problem over here, and when we worked on that, we transformed them. It was one group, AFS, I think they're called. They knew they had a problem because their business was declining, and so we did something called an information flow analysis, which was we came in and we talked to people, brought together a cross-sectional group of people, and asked them how they did their business, what kind of information did they need to do their business, and we literally laid out the flow of the information across the organization. And I remember this took about 6 weeks. I went to the president to present it to her, and when she saw what it was, she said, "Madeleine, you have saved us." And she meant it. And we did, because then they began to implement these new flows, and they were able to get moving on.
I mean, you worked with some of the great blue ribbon companies in the country.
Yes.
And elsewhere, I'm sure. Do you miss doing that? You still do it to a degree, right?
I still do it. I don't do it as much because I want to do more speaking.
Right.
Because that's what I have a feeling that's how I can get to more people with my message. Do I miss it?
Well, if you're still doing it, you don't miss it. You may not be doing as much, but you are still doing it.
Exactly.
But you're doing other things to keep active.
I'm doing other things.
Why do you like speaking? What do you get out of that?
You know, when I speak with someone, I literally can feel the energy coming from them as well as the energy that I'm giving to them. It's, you know, we don't know how to measure that, but I'm absolutely convinced that it exists. And I really like that. I like that interaction with people. Just last week, I worked with a group, spoke to them for about an hour. And, you know, I would just look around and I'd see smiles and heads nodding, and questions then would come back to me. And we just had a great time together.
And you're coaching, you know, coaches work individually.
Yes.
And a lot of coaches coach groups.
Yes.
Do you do group coaching?
I've never done group coaching.
I was just wondering if it worked, you know. I don't know how well it works or
well,
not.
other than the fact that I do it as a consulting activity where, for example, a group may have difficulty refining their mission statement. And you might think of that as coaching them to develop that. That was a fun engagement, by the way. It took us a while. And not actually, it didn't take us a great deal of time. But they worked hard to make it happen. And I just gave them a little process that I would work them through and tell them how good they had done, which they had. And then they got it.
By the way, I have to ask you, what was it like being a division chief at the World Bank? That sounds so prestigious and so, yeah, that's a big deal.
It was a big deal. It was a huge deal because I was division chief at the time that the PC was being introduced into the bank. Now, can you imagine having to deal with that transition as an organization from managers who had secretaries that they dictated to and signed memos, et cetera. And we were there helping them do that transition from that to sitting with a machine at their desk where they did their own typing. So yes, it was really significant. We started out, I think we had 17 people in the division. When we ended, there was something like 70 because there was such a demand and we were evidently successful in what we did. For example, this is so amazing. I still have to pinch myself when I think about it. I created something called the helpline. And at the bank, you dial 32121 to get to the helpline. They still have that. And that's 30 years later. The other thing that I thought was just amazing was, and I forget, it just went out of my head. Yeah. Okay, what was it, Madeleine? Come on.
Well, I was going to point out, the World Bank, a lot of people don't know, but they don't lend money to companies. They lend money to countries.
That's correct.
It's a big deal. Yeah.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
And it was a bigger deal then, before a lot of the other organizations that came in to begin to fund. Yeah. Which, of course, to me, was a real plus for the World Bank. The fact that they had proved that you can loan things to countries, money to countries to do major things, and that it has an impact. I think banks needed to see that success before they then entered into it. I mean, it used to be that the World Bank was the only guy on the block, and now, goodness, they maybe they have 10% of the business. Yeah. But yes, it was a big deal at the time, and it was a very prestigious institution, always. And so you were always working with the best people in literally the world. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that must be a great job. You were on a cloud.
I was. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Yeah.
I know you coach people. We've been talking about that. I'm wondering if you use techniques from the book in your coaching practice, and if so, what have been the results?
I do use techniques. When I start with a person, I really want to understand, first of all, what they feel their need for a coach is. Are they trying to make a transition? Are they looking for a promotion? Do they have they're just uncomfortable with where they are in their lives and they want to explore that? And chapter 1 literally talks about exactly that, because you have to ultimately, by the end of chapter 1, make a choice that you're going to continue to think about learning through the rest of your life. And so once we've got that well defined in the discussion, sometimes the people will say, great, I'm done. And they go off and do their thing. More often, they will stay with me and we'll get into some of the other things so that they get a sense of their strengths as other people perceive them, and what they were really interested in. And then we work out some of the details. So it's a very natural process to walk through. And I take them as far as they need me, because I'm very much focused as a coach. I'm not one to stay with somebody for 3 years. That's not what I want for the person. I want them to come to me with, this is where the issue is. Let's work on that issue. And then when I get through that issue, make me whole enough that I can continue, and I'll come back to you if I need to. So that to me is more satisfying as a coach, that I can see that person take off for themselves.
How long do you typically work with a client?
Gosh, I've worked with one, the longest was like 4 months.
That's not long.
That's not long, that's right. Oh, she was bright. Oh my God, she was so bright. Another time, I worked with the person literally for 1 hour in 2 half-hour segments.
Really?
Really.
And it worked?
And it worked. She came to me and she said, I'm going into my performance evaluation. Yeah. It's time for me to get a promotion. I want you to help me. And so we had a half-hour session talking about that. I gave her a little bit of homework. 2 weeks later, she came back to me and we did another half hour where she had done her homework. She walked in and she got her promotion.
And is it common for you to hear back from people that you've worked with to know whether you have success stories or not?
Mostly, yes, because usually people are very proud about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was only one case where I didn't hear back. I was working with world-renowned economists. I mean, world-renowned economists, and they were doing a series of lectures as a group. And the year before, when they did this, they do it they do this every week. I'm sorry, every year. That last year they did terribly. So they brought me in to say, we've got to be better at this. So I said, okay. And there I worked with each of them 1 hour. That's all I had with them. And of course I wasn't going to coach them on their economics. That's their business.
Right.
But I coached them on what did they really want to accomplish. And I'll never forget one gentleman said, I just don't want anybody to walk out when I'm talking. And I said, great, I know just what you need to do. And I gave each of them like one strategy. And it turned out they never came back to me as individuals to say how it went. But the evaluation at the end of their session was that they had gone from the bottom to the top, and they were thrilled.
You ever get intimidated by some people who come to you and ask for help because they are so successful?
No.
No? That's interesting. I would assume some people are intimidated by you, considering they know your background.
Actually, yes. And I've worked very hard to make people not be that way. But I can't not be who I am. But come back to your earlier question about being intimidated. If they are coming to me for my help,
Yeah.
I absolutely respect where they are. But it would be counterintuitive or counter to the purpose if I were intimidated, which would mean I would withdraw and withhold things from them. My whole idea is to open up and help them.
Do you ever turn someone down for coaching, saying, I'm not the right person for you?
Not for coaching, but for consulting practice, yes. Because when somebody doesn't, there are certain characteristics. If they're really not interested in moving forward, why spend time? But if they have a sincere desire to solve a problem, change something, then I'm always willing to work.
Your book has suggestions for individuals to use in their lives to make sure they have the access to the right kind of information that they need. Can this kind of material be used by people in business, in the world of business as well?
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. I mean, the whole issue of knowledge management, which has been around for, 30, 40 years, is all about providing access to the information that you need to get your job done. Now, that's called knowledge management because that's more elegant. But knowledge is just information on which you can take action or make a decision. So it's, in a sense, it's information in action. So it's all the same thing to me.
You've worked with teams, organizations, individuals, almost every kind of group. I'm wondering how the ideas in this book have changed how you do this, your work.
I think what has changed is a confidence in myself that I can provide them with strategies specific to making sure they have the information they need to do their work. Without having taken the time that I did to understand how people really want to get their information, where they get their information, how they get it, I would have been more general in my advice. Now I can be quite specific if the situation calls for it. So in that sense, it's helped. I think it's also organized my thinking so that I can really take them through steps that I've thought through very carefully. And I know that if you do that, then it's going to work out in the end.
You like coaching?
I love it. I love it.
Why?
Because you see a person feeling a need, and what you do is you encourage that person to actually fill their own need. You don't fill it for them. You just encourage them to understand it and see what they can themselves apply And it's very satisfying. I mean, and I'm going to say this and it's not going to sound quite right, but it's like watching a child develop. As a parent, you haven't done the growing that the child has done, but you feel a sense of satisfaction that you've contributed to that. And coaching is not with a child, and it's not childlike, but still you get that same sense of satisfaction that you've really contributed to that individual.
Even though that individual might be a highly accomplished, successful business person
Sure.
at that point in their life.
Sure. Because they came to you because they had some need.
Yep.
And if you're able to help them, then that's great.
You encourage people to consult with a coach?
I would never discourage someone from coach. I would want to know what their issue was.
Yeah.
Once I understood what their issue was, then I would say, yes, this is a good one for a coach. Or I might say, coaching is not the thing here. What you really want to do is X, Y, Z. Yeah. See, there's so much that you can pretend to do. But in the end, what you're doing is you're solving somebody else's problem, or you're helping another person solve their problem. That's where your focus has to be. I have colleagues who come in and talk about all this wonderful processes and methods that they know and they have studied. And to me, that's immaterial to the client. Client wants to know, do you understand my problem? And if you understand my problem, do you have the right things to bring to it? And you don't have to tell them what you're bringing. You just have to say yes. And then
How do you use a book today in your own life?
believe it or not, I reread some of the stories
Really?
from the people. Yeah. Well, so many stories, I can't remember them all.
Right.
Because they're very inspiring. So in that sense, I use it for that. I still do some of the processes. I still have a practice partner. In fact, one practice partner died. And, you know, that was really, really difficult.
Felt cheated.
I was very disappointed.
Yeah.
Because he and I we clicked. And when I wanted to just, share an idea, he was perfect for asking questions. And so I felt really disappointed and sorry that he was gone out of my life.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
The book is filled with strategies. What's the most popular strategy you think that you've included in the book? How would you answer that?
It's definitely the practice partner.
Really?
That's the one that I think it's because it's very different than anything else in other books. And people, and that it's useful. And that's actually something else that I'm doing with the new edition. Since writing the book, I've been collecting different strategies from other things I read, things I've seen. So I have like 165 more strategies that I'm going to bring back into the book.
Today, information is so readily accessible. Why would I want to take the time to try and figure out how I want to get that information?
Yeah, you can go onto Google and you can write your question, and there it is.
And get the answer right away.
And get the answer right away.
Right.
But those are specific things. You got to think about the question and write it in the right form and with the right keywords, and then it comes through. I think that people are more serious about learning than just a quick answer to a question. I know I love to go onto Google and ask a simple question. I love to go to YouTube and say, is there a YouTube on how to fix a such and such? And it's great because you get what's called just-in-time training. But there are bigger issues in my life where I really want to understand, how does neuroscience relate to management practice? And that's a big topic. And so there is a case where I will work through the process to discover where I need to go on a regular basis to discover that linkage.
You've written 4 books now.
Mm-hmm.
You have any others? You're updating one book.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any others that you're thinking of writing?
Yes. And it's been on my mind for about 20 years.
Wow.
It
About time you got around to it.
Well, I've sort of been approaching it, shall we say. And I'll tell you why. When I wrote my dissertation, there was a little assumption in my model, dissertations always have some kind of model in them. Right. And it said, create a learning environment. Well, it took me 15 years to figure out what I meant by that and what was really about that. And it turns out that it's a very deep topic. Riding the current was a part of that because it's all about how people learn. The resilience piece was a part of that because when you create an environment that produces resilience in not just the individuals but in the whole groups, what comes out of that is learning as well, and it really is the equivalent of a learning environment. But I'd still like to have a book where I really focus just on how does a manager create a learning environment for his team.
And you write too. You write blogs in Psychology Today,
Yes.
is that right?
Yes, I do.
Where do you find time to do all of this? Plus coach, plus consult, plus teach, plus whatever else you do.
Actually, I should spend more time writing blogs, but be that as it may, your question's still valid. I'm a busy person. I rarely pause. I go down to the office at a particular hour and I work for 10 hours straight. I may take some time for lunch, but it's very short. Because that's just my rhythm. When I get to the end of the day, that's the end of the day. And I don't allow a lot of interaction other than conversations with colleagues in my network, and I do have a great network around the world. So you stay very focused. That's how you do it. Also, I have, why do I forget this all the time? There's a strategy that I recommend as part of becoming a resilient leader, and it's called decide for the day the most important thing you can do. And that thing may be as complicated as finishing a proposal and you've been putting it off because you know it's going to take 4 hours of work. Or it could be, to call your mother. Whatever's the most important thing.
Getting your car washed.
Getting your car, whatever it is, it's important.
Right.
Because it has impact across many, many spheres of your life. In fact, I am a list person. I love lists. In fact, I'm one of these people who actually write something on the list and strike it off because it just feels good to strike it off. And I just decided that's who I am and I'm going to live with that. I'm not going to worry about that. Well, my lists got very long and the lists became overwhelming. So I said, you're telling people to pick the most important thing. So pick the most important thing, Madeleine. And I did. I started doing it. Well, it turns out that my lists for the day are now about 3, at most 4 items.
That's good.
Yes, because I get them done.
Yeah.
And what I found was I went back to these long lists, and lo and behold, they were getting done. Why? Because what was on the long list were tasks. They weren't really big things that had to get done. So that's one place where my own advice has worked.
You happy in what you're doing now?
I love it. Oh, yes, I'm very happy. I'm very happy.
It shows.
Thank you.
It shows.
I met with someone recently and she said, Madeleine, you just exude happiness. And I said, oh, what can I say?
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I love working with you.
You're welcome.